File item 49, SB 145. The clerk will read.
Senate Bill 145 by Senator Weiner and accolade the sex offenders.
Ms. Kamlager, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I rise to present Senate Bill 145, which will end California's highly discriminatory treatment of specific sex acts by our state's sex offender registry law by giving courts discretion over all cases of voluntary intercourse between teenagers and young adults. Under current law, if a young person has voluntary sexual intercourse with a minor aged 14 through 17 and is no more than 10 years older than the minor, the offense is not automatically registerable. However, the court has discretion based on the facts of the case to decide whether or not to place the defendant on the sex offender registry. On the other hand, if any other sex act is performed, then it is mandatory that the court place the defendant on the sex offender registry regardless of the facts of the case. This disparate treatment of these sex acts is a vestige from the anti-LGBT laws in the 1940s that criminalized gay sex. Tragically, in 2019, our laws still mandate that a young person in a consensual relationship who is convicted of performing these specific sex acts must be placed on the sex offender registry, and our courts are barred from using discretion, the word we like so much, to keep them off, even though a similarly situated young person convicted of statutory rape wouldn't have the same restriction. This distinction in the law is irrational and discriminatory towards LGBT youth, as it treats these acts as more egregious of a crime than statutory rape. SB 145 ends blatant discrimination against young people engaged in voluntary sexual activity by giving courts the discretion to decide at sentencing if registering the defendant as a sex offender is appropriate, regardless of the sex act they performed. To be clear, nothing in this bill decriminalizes any of these offenses or prevents anyone from being placed on the registry if a prosecutor recommends it or the court orders it. SB 45 is a law enforcement sponsored and supported bill. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Kamlager. Ms. Gonzalez, you are recognized.
Madam Speaker, I unfortunately am rising in opposition to this bill, and I wouldn't have spoken except that people have misconstrued my opposition, so I want to be very clear. The equity argument that Equality California and others have promoted for this bill, I completely agree with. In fact, I agree with it so much that the amendments that they gave me to take in appropriations, which would have still created a two-tier system, I refuse to take, because it is about equitable solutions. Any sex is sex. I don't care who it's between or what sex act it is. That being said, I cannot, in my mind as a mother, understand how sex between a 24-year-old and a 14-year-old could ever be consensual, how it could ever not be a registerable offense. I don't care what kind of sex it is. I don't care if it's traditional. I'm not going to go there. But the bottom line is, when a 24-year-old has sex with a 14-year-old, it is always in an inequitable situation. Most of the time, it's a teacher and student. It might be a Bible study instructor, a coach, and a student. I've had 14-year-olds. I've asked everybody, as this has sat in my committee for 2 years, amend both sides of the bill. Amend the current situation where one sex act between a 24 and a 14-year-old might be considered consensual by a judge, and amend this so we can have equity, because it should be equitable. But we should never give up on this idea that children should be in any way subject to a predator. And that's what it is. I cannot, and I've never heard, and I've challenged everybody, give me a situation where a 24-year-old had sex with a 14-year-old, any kind of sex, and it wasn't predatory. Any example, and I've yet to see it. I have been the mother of a 14-year-old over and over and over again, and I'm sorry. Until you can show me that, I can't vote for this bill. As much as I want to create an equitable situation, I think this needs to go back to the drawing board. I think we need to take up both portions of the code and make a determination. I understand it leaves it up to a judge. It leaves it up to a judge. I still have never seen a single instance by which a 24-year-old should be having sex with a 14-year-old. With that, I respectfully ask for no vote.
Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. Mr. Choi, you are recognized.
Thank you, Speaker and the members of the Assembly. I stand today in opposition of SB 145. Colleagues, as a lifelong educator, we place adults in places of trust with the youth and the children. In an age of historic sex trafficking and child trafficking here in California, I think this bill is entirely inappropriate. I don't understand why a 24-year-old volunteer coach should not have to register as a sex offender for being with a 15-year-old student. Statutory rape should be a registerable offense either way, and by lowering this offense, colleagues, we are signaling to families and the children everywhere that we support these abusive situations. If you look at the summary of this bill, it provides that the persons convicted of sodomy, oral copulation, or sex penetration by foreign object under specified provisions of law would not be required to register as sex offenders if at the time of offense the person is not more than 10 years older than the minor, and the conviction is only one requiring the person to register. I mean, this is unbelievable. What kind of a bill is this? What kind of a law are we trying to enact by this body? This is intolerable. It is for those reasons that I respectively beg you to vote no against this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. Ms. Friedman, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Certainly, this is a difficult bill, and it's a difficult subject. I'm also a mom, and I agree that it would be pretty much impossible for me to imagine a situation where sex between a 25-year-old and a 14-year-old could be consensual. I just don't believe that exists. However, what current law says is that it's possible for a judge to decide that sex between a 24-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl is consensual, but sex between a 19-year-old man and a 17-year-old boy must lead to that 19-year-old being placed on the sex registry for life. That is why the current law is not equitable. If there is a problem with judges ruling that sex between a 25-year-old and a 14-year-old of any gender is allowable, we should probably take a look at that law and changing that law. But that is not the question that is in front of us now. The question that's in front of us now is, why are we treating sex between two same-gendered people completely differently than sex between a man and a woman? That is the question in front of us now, and that is not justifiable within the context of our values in this state. And yes, there are cases where the state is wasting resources monitoring an 18-year-old who's on the registry because he had sex with his 17-year-old boyfriend. That is factual cases here in California. That is why this bill is supported by law enforcement and by survivors advocates and by Children Now, and the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault are supporting this bill because we have dangerous sex offenders in California that need monitoring. But if we're wasting our time monitoring 18-year-olds who had sex with 17-year-olds, which, by the way, if it was a young man and a young woman, would not be on the registry, but is because they were the same gender, we are not using valuable resources monitoring truly dangerous sexual predators. So let's be clear about what this bill is and what this bill is not, because there's a lot of hyperbole and a lot of emotions over it that are getting in the way of us seeing that this is purely an equity issue. It is not decriminalizing statutory rape by any extent. With that, I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Friedman. Mr. Maritsucci, you are recognized.
Thank you very much. As a former criminal prosecutor, I rise in support of SB 145. Now, I usually do not rise in support of a bill from Senator Wiener on a sex offender registration issue, but this is an exception. As my colleague from Glendale pointed out, this is trying to rectify this outdated inequity between straight sex versus gay sex. I completely appreciate the comments made by our colleague from San Diego. As a parent, it is hard to imagine anything that would not be predatory given some of the circumstances that she described. But again, I mean, this gives the judge the discretion. You know, and as a former prosecutor, I know that I have prosecuted cases where I felt bad that there would be a potential lifetime designation, the scarlet letter on someone as a sex offender registered for life, you know, when it involved consensual sex. I think it's important that this bill is co-sponsored by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. This bill is supported by the California District Attorney's Office and the California Police Chiefs. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Maritsucci. Mr. Mathis, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I think when we start getting into these questions of equity and how well balanced this is for everyone, you know, there are some good points when you bring up the handful of cases where it's within a few years. But when you start talking about this 10-year gap that this opens up, it tears at the moral fiber of our state, of our community, of our families. And this bill just goes too far. I ask you all to consider that. Think about it. How would you feel if it was your 14-year-old and somebody was 10 years older than them? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mathis. Mr. Mays, you are recognized.
So thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I rise in support of this bill. But I did not last week support this bill because unlike some of my colleagues who are attorneys, unlike some of our colleagues who were prosecutors, some of them defense attorneys, understand the law, some of our colleagues who were in law enforcement, sometimes these sorts of bills are bills that are challenging for us. But I found this one particularly interesting because the California District Attorneys Association was in support. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why are the prosecutors across this state, the organization supporting this bill? So I thought, you know, I'm going to reach out to my two DAs. So I called the Riverside County District Attorney, and I called the San Bernardino County District Attorney, spoke with both of them. And it turns out that one of those district attorneys is an expert in these sex crimes cases. And he said, Chad, I need to spend a little bit of time just digging into this. And after he did, he called me the next day, spent 15 minutes with me going through it, and he said, this bill is righteous and it is just. This coming from a conservative prosecutor. These are the types of bills, members, that it's very easy for us politically to take a pass on. If you vote for this, for sure, you're going to get a hit. I'm going to take a hit because I'm voting for it tonight. I guarantee you're going to take a hit on this bill. But at some moment in time, it's our job. We say this all the time. It's the legislature's responsibility to make good laws. That's what this says just in front of us. This is one of those bills you will take a political hit for. but we also know that it's righteous and it is just. This is the time to step up, and I urge and I vote this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Mays. Seeing and hearing no further debate on the matter, Ms. Comlager, would you like to close?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank my colleagues for the robust discussion on this bill. It's always hard on this floor to talk about sex because I think some folks still just don't know how to deal with it. I want to...
Ms. Comlager, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't see that Ms. Weber was seeking recognition. Do you mind if we come back to you for your close? Thank you. Dr. Weber, you are recognized in the rear of the chamber. I apologize.
No problem. I will be very, very brief. I thought there were other folks wanting to talk. I've come here obviously today because I think this is very important. And this is a bill really about social justice and equality. That's what it's really about. And we have seen time and time again, even on this floor, where we've seen acts that have occurred in the past that have made us embarrassed because of the policies that we have that discriminate. And we've seen ourselves grappling with those issues and overturning past policies and celebrating individuals who had been abused because of their own sexual orientation. We did that this year, and we've done it before. It is now time that we recognize that the issue of this is not really just the other aspects of the law, but really the issue of fairness and justice and equality, and not our own biases with regards to sexual preference and those kinds of things. And so we can create images that it's, that everything's going amok. But when we have our own district attorneys and others who are very conservative in their point of view, saying this is an unjust practice that we have, and that this law needs to be changed so that we can treat everyone with fairness, regardless of their sexual orientation. So I strongly recommend that we vote aye on SB 145, because it's the right thing to do, regardless of what you think in your own personal life. This is about not having discrimination. And we have to acknowledge the fact that we have done that since the history of this country, and every now and then we have to step forward and make it right. I respectfully ask for an aye vote for one.
Thank you, Dr. Weber, and thank you, Ms. Comlager, for your indulgence. Back to you for your close.
No worries, thank you. I want to just reiterate that there is still judicial discretion in this bill. Some folks mentioned the 10-year cap. The 10-year cap is actually consistent with current law, and if folks are challenged with that, I actually urge in next legislative session to do a bill that focuses on that 10-year gap, but that is not this bill. SB 145 does not change the offenses for sex crimes with a minor. This bill does not decriminalize any kind of sexual criminal acts. It allows prosecutors to continue placing offenders on the sex offender registry. As was mentioned, it is supported and in fact sponsored by law enforcement. And I want to just say that if, a 19-year-old has consensual sex with a 17-year-old and something goes awry in the relationship, that 19-year-old gay child will be put on the sex offender registry. It will be mandatory. And we talk so much about how we support LGBT rights. How would you feel having to tell the parent of that 19-year-old that they deserve to be on the sex registry for life because they're gay? That is essentially what we would be saying. And that is what we are fighting against when we vote for SB 145. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll and tally the vote. Ayes 41, noes 18. The measure passes.